This happened about 5 years ago. I am a female, and at the time I was 21. I was visiting my old hometown, and I and some old school friends decided to go to a local club. For some reason I can't remember, I left earlier than others and decided to walk home since it was only a couple of kilometers, and taxis are expensive. It was winter and very quiet. No one to be seen anywhere. I walked very fast because it was cold and I wanted to get home quickly. Then I saw a man walking in an opposite direction, but at first thought nothing of it and assumed he was just some person going home from a bar or party like me. He greeted me, but I didn't know him and just kept on walking without answering. To my horror, he turned around and started following me, and I dialed the emergency number on my phone and put it in my pocket so that I could make a secret call if he did anything sketchy. He ran up to me and started asking me questions like why I was walking alone, what my name was, and did I live here, etc. I didn't really answer anything and told him I didn't need company. He was starting to really creep me out, and then he told me he was going to walk me home so that nobody does anything to me. I wanted to scream at him that you are the only fucking person here who can do anything. Fuck off. I don't know if he actually had some superhero complex and really just wanted to save damsels in distress. But I wasn't in distress until he came along, and he was drunk, and if you don't mind me saying, he looked a bit crazy. Then he proceeded to grab my hand like we were some romantically involved couple. I didn't dare to resist, and my home was very close, so I didn't want to anger him. When I saw my house, I told him that I was fine now and he could let me go. He asked if I was home alone, and I told him that my sister and her boyfriend were there. That seemed to put him off, and he hugged me, told me goodbye, and left. I almost ran home. I never saw him again, but later a friend of mine who lived close to my home told me of a similar experience. Maybe a year after that, my mom told me she had been walking home late at night, and some creep had followed her too, saying the exact same things about making sure nothing happens, as he said to me. I'm a 20-year-old single mom, and I used to live in an apartment with just my daughter and our dog. I work at a restaurant, and I get off really late, between 11:30 and 12:30 p.m. I usually walked home because my apartment was only just a few blocks away. On the walk home, I'd take a shortcut and pass by a trail that leads into a decently wooded area, and it looks pretty fucking sketchy at night. I lived in a fairly nice neighborhood, but you just never know. A few months ago, I was walking home as usual, talking on the phone with a friend, and as I walked by the trail woods, I decided to sit down and have a smoke while I finished talking to my friend. As soon as I hang up the phone and I'm about to put out my cigarette, a guy walks out of the woods and comes up to me. He was a pretty normal looking guy, except he wasn't wearing a shirt. At midnight, and it's like 40 degrees outside, he asked me if I had a cigarette, and I told him I had just smoked my last one, which was true. He sort of just stared at me, and I got a little weirded out and told him to have a good night and turned to keep walking. The guy calls out to me, and when I turned to look back at him, he had actually sped up and was standing so close to me that I jumped backwards in surprise. I could see in his face at this point that this dude was not sober in the slightest. Not drunk, but like whacked out beyond belief. I said to him, "Can I help you with something?" And he replies, "Are you sure you don't have a cigarette?" And I see his eyes dart back and forth towards my purse. I started backing away and told him, yeah, I was sure. I took out my empty pack of cigarettes and showed him. He doesn't even look at them. He's still staring at me with his weird whacked out eyes and nods. I stood there for a second and then turned back around. I pulled my phone out immediately and called my brother, who was at my apartment babysitting my daughter, pretending to just be checking in. When I got to the end of the street, I looked back and the guy was still standing in the exact spot. I asked my brother to stay on the phone with me because I was just kind of freaked out, and he agreed. It was only about 10 more minutes until I got back to my apartment, but during these 10 minutes, it was like every second that I got closer, my paranoia and anxiety would escalate. I kept feeling like I was being watched and followed, and I thought a few times that I heard footsteps right behind me at my heels. I looked over my shoulder a lot, but there wasn't anybody. I finally got home and was so damn relieved. I even felt a little silly for being so scared. Everybody's had an encounter with a tweaker at least once in their life, right? My brother left, my daughter was asleep, and I was lying in bed reading with my dog, Captain. It was about 2:30 a.m. Suddenly, Captain perked his head up, alert, looking towards the bedroom door. I asked him what was wrong, and he didn't even move. I waited to see if he just startled himself awake, but then he started growling that low, deep, guttural growl that every dog does when there's something around that they really don't like. I began petting him and telling him everything was alright before I heard a loud thud from somewhere. I sat up, heart pounding, and immediately grabbed the machete I keep under my bed. Sometimes a knife just doesn't do. I had just stepped out of my bedroom when there was a huge crash that was unmistakably the sound of my sliding glass door shattering. Captain starts barking like mad, and I literally jump on him and clamp his mouth shut. Let me also point out that I live on the second floor. Hoping and praying that some douchebag threw a goddamn rock over my balcony, or some shit, I waited. It was quiet for a minute, and then I heard the sound of footsteps on a glass. I let Captain go, who immediately bolted into the living room, and I jumped up, flipping the hall light on, and ran after Captain to grab my phone off the kitchen counter and call the police. And then I see him. That same whacked out dude from earlier had followed me home after all. Captain had cornered him in between my couch and the opposite wall, crouched down low and barking, snarling at his feet, and snapping at him if he tried to move or sidestep. The dude is staring at me, and as I'm on the phone with the police, he says, "I just wanted a cigarette." Captain kept the tweaker cornered until the police came and arrested him. Turns out, he had a warrant out for his arrest for a heroin-related crime, and also for the rape and assault of an ex-girlfriend. And a neighbor of mine had actually already called the police to report him before I called, because they saw him just standing in the parking lot, outside my building all shirtless and weird-looking, and then he began scaling the building to get into my apartment. I ended up moving out because I didn't feel safe anymore, and the apartment complex didn't even make me pay out of my lease because they felt sorry for me. I don't want to think about what would have happened if I didn't have Captain. I'm 22, female, and live in London, and I have for 4 years. I was coming home from a gig one Wednesday night. It was probably around 11:30, and I had just made my switch to my final tube line of the night. It was fairly busy. I'd say probably around 10 or so people were in the same carriage as me. I sit down on the flip-out seats nearest the door. As I've just been to a gig, I'm a little tipsy, but definitely not drunk. I'm very cautious of my surroundings. There's a couple of girls sat opposite me, and then a small-ish man. Everyone looks fairly normal. The man gets up and flips out the seat next to me and sits down. Now, to put me into some context, I'm a 5'8" competitive weightlifter, and this evening I was wearing all black with a leather jacket and heavy boots. I look like I'm in a lesbian biker gang. If someone was going to attack anyone, I would be a fair challenge. So when this lil dude sits down next to me, I'm like, okay, a bit weird that he moved from the more comfortable seats to the shitty flippy out ones. I quickly glance over him. He doesn't look crazy. He doesn't smell of anything. He doesn't look high, and he's dressed fairly well. But he sits there, completely angled towards me, like he's turned as far in my direction as he can. I can feel his gaze boring a hole into the side of my head. I have my headphones in, and I just look straight ahead. So then he starts twitching, like someone with Tourette's stifling a tick. So I'm genuinely put at ease for a little while. However, with the twitching, he starts biting his hands, and again I'm like, just a tick thing. But then he just sinks his teeth in, flesh, blood, and everything. He loosens his hold on his hand, and then twitches and bites down again. So naturally I'm like, I'm gonna get the fuck off this sealed underground container. So I get off at the next stop. The stop I actually need to get off at is the one a couple after this one. Walk off the platform as if I'm leaving, so he'd think I was leaving. Because I was on the Victoria line, I just assumed another tube would be along in the next couple of minutes. However, it wasn't, and I didn't want to miss the last train home, so I go another way onto the platform and get back on the same train a few cars down. Now, when I got off the first car, the creepy guy looked at me super weirdly, kind of like longingly. I can't even place the kind of look it was, really. It just freaked me the fuck out. So we get to the next stop, and I see this guy walking down the platform. Now at 11:40 p.m. on a Wednesday night, when you're alone, you barrel down the platform to the exit as quickly as you can move. Nobody really wants to hang about down there. So when I see the creepy guy just ambling down the platform at the next stop, it tells me something is off. He's walking, looking around, looking dejected. Then he clocks me. It becomes painfully apparent to him that I'd moved down the train to get away from him. Luckily, the doors had just closed. He makes eye contact with me and starts shrieking and banging on the closed doors, blood from his bitten hand smearing everywhere as the train pulled away. That sight has rattled me and has continued to do so months afterwards. I've flown with my 1-year-old solo nearly a dozen times. Usually people are understanding about me having a baby on my lap, and overall he's a happy, easy baby. He's also very cute, so it's not uncommon for strangers to talk to him. Usually I don't mind. The last trip I took, I sat alone in my aisle, with a man sitting by himself directly behind me. My baby was tired and fussing. I knew he was tired, but there's not a lot I could do until after we took off. Right out the gate, the man behind was talking to my baby, saying, "Oh, hi, baby. Why sad, baby?" I smiled and replied that he was tired. Sorry for the fuss, thank you. After takeoff, I started to get him settled for a nap. The man behind us continued to talk to my baby, putting his hand through the seats to try and grab his feet. Multiple times I asked him nicely to please stop. My baby was tired. You're distracting him. He just needs a nap. Finally, I set my baby down next to me. He stood on the floor facing the seat next to me, so that I could make a bottle. The man behind me stood up and reached over my seat to pick him up. I immediately leaned forward to pick up the baby, saying, "No, thank you, I don't need help. Please, no, thank you." The man pushed me back into my seat while mumbling, "Sweet baby, why baby cry?" I replied very loudly, "No," and quickly picked up my baby. I thought that was the end of that. I was wrong. I tried to rock my baby to sleep while desperately trying not to lose my cool. As I'm rocking the baby, the man behind me reached through our seats to grab my arm, saying, no rocking, you make him cry." I pulled free from him and yelled, "Do not touch me." Again, I thought that'd be the end. I started rocking the baby for a second time. This time, the man behind me reached both hands around either side of my seat to hold me in place, saying, No rocking, stop rocking." I am somewhat embarrassed that I completely lost it, clutching my baby to my chest while struggling to get free of him. It hurt. I hit the call light while screaming, "Let me go, do not touch me, let me go." He was still holding me by my arms when the flight attendants came running. I could barely get anything out to the flight attendants. Everyone around us was staring. I was sobbing, and all I could get out was that I could not sit there anymore. And for the love of God, please move me. The man behind me tried to move with me, but I told the flight attendants that I did not know him and he could not come with me. I had a good cry in my new seat, but my baby immediately went to sleep. I was moved to be next to the flight attendants' seats. After calming down, I explained to the flight attendants what had happened. Multiple times, the man that had been behind me got up to try to come back to my new seat, only to be turned around by one of the flight attendants. Towards the end of the flight, one of the flight attendants told me that they had explained everything to the pilot, and the pilot had called the FBI and local police to escort the man off the flight. I would also be escorted off, as well as everyone around us that had watched everything happen. He cheered as he was escorted off. I had to interview with the FBI and nearly missed my next flight. After my trip was done, I had to fly back, going through the same airport. It was stressful and emotional to say the least, even knowing that he was banned from the airline and the airport. I haven't flown since. This happened to me about a month ago, but it still boggles me. 2 points of background to make this story make sense. 1. I live in Tokyo and commute via those famously crazy crowded trains daily. There exists on them this kind of unspoken agreement that everyone works together to make this suck as little as possible. People for the most part hold their backpacks in front of them, men don't manspread, etc., but that's when the trains are full. About 2 stops before mine, the train goes from sardine can to everyone on this train could lay on the seats and have room left over. So usually I can sit down at this point. 2. I'm not a Japanese woman. Very obviously so, even when I'm in my white dress shirt and pencil skirt like all the other office drones. I'm often the only obviously non-Japanese woman on my train in the morning, but despite my appearance, I'm fluent in Japanese. So one day I sit down when the train empties out, headphones in, mobile game going, ready to enjoy the 10 minutes of sitting I get on my hour commute. I'm sitting with my legs crossed, but there's maybe 10 people in the whole car, so I'm not in anyone's way. I'm tuned out when all of a sudden a hand reaches out and grabs my bare knee. I'm in a skirt. I, of course, jolt straight out of my skin, rip out my headphones, and look up at the hand's owner. He's some skinny old Japanese dude, 60s. He points at my legs, then at other people on the train. Again, a max of 10 in a car that can hold 50 plus easily, and probably held about 80 10 minutes ago. In slightly broken English, he says, "You must not cross legs." I'm so bewildered by this, I start to tell him in Japanese. The train isn't crowded right now, I'm not in anyone's way. But he doesn't like this answer. He starts to reach for my legs again, presumably to uncross my legs himself. I, liking even less of this, summon up my loudest non-scream, "Don't touch me." And thankfully this is enough to get him to stop that, as another thing you don't do on trains here is make a fuss. Sadly though, yet another thing you don't do here is get involved. So despite a woman all but screaming, "Don't touch me," it's some foreign woman causing trouble, best not to get involved, etc., etc., so no one comes over. So while I've made it clear that I will not stand for physical confrontation, this old dude still feels comfortable enough to stand directly in front of me, nearly knee to knee, looming over me while he repeats endlessly, "You must." He did this for at least 5 minutes. I didn't move. I didn't blink or break eye contact. I started thinking of how to get off this train at the next stop. Thankfully, he gave up before the next stop, shaking his head and calling me a rude bitch in Japanese before wandering off. Still take the same train, but haven't seen him since. So I live in the PNW, which has a great number of excellent campsites. A favorite of mine isn't actually a designated campsite, but a forest road right on a river. Being a moody young woman, I would frequently make sojourns in my dumpy Toyota Camry to this one spot so I could be alone on the river and meditate on whatever was bothering me. Camping alone as a 20-something female often inspired anxiety in both myself and my folks, but I didn't let that deter me. Camping alone was something I genuinely enjoyed doing, and after experiencing a series of emotional misfortunes, I needed the time to myself. The last time I ever went to this particular spot, I must have been around 21. I had just had a closure conversation with someone who broke my heart some months prior, and wanted to take some time to process that. Luckily enough, I had gotten consecutive days off from my retail job, so I packed up my car and made the 3-hour drive to the spot. This spot is fairly well known, and often a few other campers would be there on weekends, but during the week it would more than likely be empty. By the time I arrived, it was late afternoon, and I was slightly disappointed to discover a turquoise Chevrolet truck and another silver car parked closest to the river. I parked some distance behind them and began unloading my things. 2 young gentlemen were hanging out by the truck, and as I passed by, they greeted me. I muttered a hello and kept walking. I picked a spot I thought was nice and went back to get the rest of my things. As I was passing their cars again, one of the men, the shorter, stockier one, rushed to a boulder near the path where some pistols, I later learned they were air pistols, were sitting and quickly concealed them, saying, "Oh, sorry about that. I didn't mean to scare you." There was something childlike in his manner, like he did this specifically so I would pay attention to him. I told him it was fine. I wasn't scared and kept walking. I unloaded the rest of my things, set up my camp, and got a fire going. I was kind of tired after the long day of driving and hauling my stuff around, so I plopped down in a camp chair and got some chili mac cooking for dinner. It was a beautiful evening, not too hot, and golden hour on the river is always a fantastic thing, so I was thoroughly enjoying the moment. I could see the 2 men swimming upriver a bit, but it was easy enough to ignore them. By the time I finished eating, they passed by my camp on the opposite bank and were walking into the woods. I went down to the bank to get water for my dishes and heard the stockier one call out to me. "Hey, I just wanted to let you know that I'm a good guy, okay?" Maybe this should have alarmed me more, but it didn't. I definitely thought the guy was socially inept, but left my judgments at that and elected to answer with a polite, "Okay." I wanted him to leave me alone and thought that if I was nice but uninterested, he'd take the hint. This was a demonstrably ineffective approach. Some time had passed, and I had been musing over the last week's events, and just generally enjoying the beauty around me when he came limping up to my camp. He was doing a feigned grunt as if he was in pain. I don't exactly remember the exchange we had, but he wound up sitting in my camp and explaining to me that he had had some injuries in the past that were adversely impacted by the cold of the river. Before I go any further, I'll preface this by saying I was pretty passive as a younger person, especially with strangers. I've definitely had to practice setting and maintaining boundaries as I've gotten older, in this instance demonstrates the danger of failing to do so. I kick myself every time I tell this story. I'm not sure if immediately telling the guy to piss off would have made him leave me alone, being a young pretty girl alone in the woods, but I regret not speaking my mind more clearly that day. All that said, given some previous experiences, I had taken on a policy of engaging in active listening with others who seemed to be struggling. I obviously was faced with my own woes and wanted to be treated compassionately, so I aimed to do the same with others. It was clear the guy was having issues, and by all exterior judgments, it seemed like he was down on his luck, even with some maladaptive tendencies. He continued to stay at my camp and began telling me all about his life. These stories were pretty fantastical, the kind of lies a child would tell you of some incredible adventure or grandeur. As they went on, they went into weirder and weirder territory. He explained that the aforementioned injuries that were paining him were the result of falling a great distance while on a welding job, where his hand was caught by being impaled by a piece of rebar. He described his heroic effort of self-preservation by unhooking himself from the rebar and falling the rest of the distance, breaking his legs or something like that. I just gave him a series of yeah, uh-huhs and, oh wow, that must have been painful. He revealed that he was recently homeless after splitting up with his girlfriend, who had been talking to another guy. That's why he was staying here in his truck, the aforementioned Chevy. He also told me he DJ'd at a joint in the closest town and made a lot of money doing it. He increased his exaggerations by telling me he was also a 5-star chef and enlightened me on a gross-sounding dish of his own creation that was essentially a soup made from watered-down fruit jelly and some other sweet things. He also told me that he had once been a Navy SEAL, specializing in small arms. It was then he revealed to me that the pistols he thought scared me before were air pistols, and he augmented his tale of being in special forces by demonstrating some twirls with one of them, and showing me what ultimately turned out to be some mediocre marksmanship. At a later point, he wound up giving me one of them because it made him think of doing bad things. I hesitantly accepted it. I was pretty sketched out by this point and wanted the dude to leave but lacked the backbone to tell him to go away. Unfortunately, as the evening wore on, he just continued to get weirder and weirder. By this point, he began bringing his belongings from his truck and setting them around my camp. This was a process that happened gradually, each new conversation note eliciting a new show and tell idea. I can't remember all he brought down, but it included his guitar and a lot of other stuff. He tried to give me some of it, but after the air pistol, I declined. The conversation dragged on, eventually with him telling me, in detail, about some childhood traumas. His father, who had been in the military, was very strict and often beat him. He also told me about his cousin, who had sexually abused him severely enough to leave scars in certain areas, which he described to me in detail. He got really close to me when he told me this, looking me square in the eye, unblinking. "And that's why I'd never hurt you," he said, still staring at me. I shit you not. My skin started to crawl. I had a few things to defend myself with, a hunting knife and some bear spray, but he hadn't done anything directly threatening yet. Not long after this, his ex-girlfriend showed up. He introduced me as his friend, and they talked a little bit before he kind of ignored her in favor of me. The whole thing made me even more uncomfortable. She didn't stay long and sped away in her truck, I'm assuming in some fit of jealousy. What did I do to deserve that? I didn't say anything other than I was going to bed, hoping he'd take the hint and leave. He said he needed some alone time for himself, and I thought I had lucked out. I went into my tent to bed down for the night as it had gotten dark, only to discover that a cheap ring had been left on my pillow. He must have placed it there when I stepped away to go to the bathroom or something. Furthermore, I could hear him still wandering around my campsite. I peeked out of my tent, and he had his head in his hands as he paced and was muttering to himself. A powerful feeling of needing to flee came over me. There was no way I could stay there. Even if he didn't do anything to hurt me, he at minimum would annoy me the whole 3 days I planned to stay. I immediately started to pack my stuff, and when he asked what I was doing, I told him I was just going to go. Since I was car camping, I had a bit of stuff with me that would require a few trips, and I hurried to get it all in my car. On one trip up the path to the parking area, he stood in the middle of the path, complaining that my flashlight was blinding him. I didn't say anything and stepped around him. I was most of my trips after that unbothered, though I went with one arm free so I could carry my hunting knife and be ready in case he tried to get physical with me. On my second to last trip down, he came out of the dark from the direction of his truck. He was sobbing and cried, but I didn't do anything wrong. I flat out ignored him and ventured down the path once more to grab what I could and hightail it to my car. I wound up leaving a cord of wood behind, not seeing it worth the danger to go back for it. I shut all my doors and hopped in, absolutely elated at the sound of my 30-year-old car starting right up. I got the hell out of there and drove the 3 hours back to my house. I didn't have reception until about halfway through the drive, at which point I called my mom and told her what happened. She was upset that I didn't tell her where I was going. I told my dad and stepmom, who I lived with at the time, and that she was glad I was okay. When I got back, my stepmother asked what I was doing back, and I explained what happened all over again. My dad later suggested I get a gun if I wanted to continue solo camping, in case something like that happened again. The next day, I went out to my car so I could drive to meet some friends and found my tire had gone flat. What an immense stroke of luck it was that it didn't happen at the campsite or somewhere else in the mountains where I didn't have reception. I'm in my mid-20s now and moved to the city about 6 months ago. My roommate and best friend discovered the air pistol while he was helping me move. He knew I didn't own any guns and was immediately confused, thinking it was real. I laughed and explained what happened. I haven't been back to that site since, and while I definitely bring a friend there, I probably won't go alone again. Wendell was a panhandler near my college. I always gave him my change when I had extra. Usually I keep a hard rule not to give money to individuals because I give it to known local charities instead, where I can be sure the money is going to a specific cause. This one panhandler, though, he always sang opera music. Quite beautifully, all things considered. Even though it was clear he was begging for money due to poverty and homelessness, not busking for tips. I always thought it was admirable that he was trying to perform a service in exchange for the money, and I don't like carrying coins, so gave what I could. It wasn't much, barely $1 each time. I would occasionally strike up conversations with Wendell, even if I didn't have any money for him. He liked to make students laugh with funny impressions or jokes. He was a bit older. I'm an undergrad. He was probably 40s to 50s, so we'd mostly have quick chats about the news or the weather or whatever. Nothing deep. Sometimes he'd randomly share something so intimate that I'd feel obligated to reciprocate with something at least superficially personal. E.g., he'd blurt out that he almost went to college on a baseball scholarship, but drugs ruined everything. I'd be like, "Oh wow, sorry to hear that. I play volleyball. Not for a scholarship though. See you around, okay?" Once Wendell called me over while I was walking with a professor, my advisor, and I didn't want to be rude, so I went over just to say a quick hello and introduce my advisor. When we walked away, my advisor was pretty clearly horrified and asked why Wendell knew me by name. I explained our little friendship. He said the homeless in this city weren't like the homeless in my smaller town back home. I figured he was being elitist, and I think he could tell I hadn't taken him seriously, because after we had dropped the subject, just before I left, he reiterated that I shouldn't forge friendships with the homeless population in this city, or even give them money because the chronically homeless, the ones on the streets enough that you could get to know them, tended to have criminal or addictive histories. I was surprised because my advisor is usually pretty progressive and compassionate, so I appealed to him with, Wendell is a victim of a post-capitalist society, and all the other things I'd learned in his very own classes, but he wasn't having any of it. Basically saying however Wendell became chronically homeless, now he was, and I should act accordingly. So my professor strongly implored me not to continue even talking to Wendell at all. I kind of shook my head thinking, okay boomer, and if anything, felt fortified by the warning. Like it was a confirmation that I was a radical doing the right thing, leading a new path, breaking down barriers, bettering society. I got closer to Wendell and shared more about my life with him. But the very next time I talked to Wendell, he was really irritable and distant, and I wasn't sure why. Until he said, "So your boyfriend, you two live together or what?" And I had no idea what he was talking about. I said, "What boyfriend?" And he said, "The guy I met from yesterday you were walking down the street with." And I laughed, explaining it wasn't my boyfriend, it was just my academic advisor. And all of a sudden he wasn't irritable anymore. He was as chatty as he'd ever been. I probably should have taken that as a red flag, but I didn't think about Wendell much at all then. I only saw him once or twice a week, and only for a few minutes. It was around then that Wendell started bringing me gifts. I'd pass him and he'd have a flower for me or a metal machine piece. I never refused because I figured it was a means of preserving his dignity when accepting money, like with his opera singing. One of my roommates did remark on the flower once, and when I explained, she said it was weird. I thought she was also just being elitist and that I was enlightened, bridging the class divide and superior to her neoliberal paranoia. I mean, come on, it was just a flower. My advisor clocked all this, so brought it up with me again a while later, saying he was worried I was being manipulated. I tried to tell him about Wendell's opera singing and impressions and how he even almost went to college, but then I remembered the reason he lost his baseball scholarship, and I stopped short. Looking at it through that lens kind of made me reconsider the whole thing. I thought about what my professor had said. Sparing the details, we did talk for like half an hour, and I finally connected the dots that Wendell did have a history of drug use. And he did sometimes mention how a previous girlfriend, overreacting to something he'd done, had derailed his life besides the drugs. So I decided maybe I should think about distancing myself a little. But very shortly after, the pandemic hit and classes went virtual, so to save on rent, I went home to my parents' house. Still in the state, but not near campus at all. About 3 weeks into being home, I was watching a friend's Insta story when I heard Wendell singing opera in the background, and I thought, "Aw, I forgot all about him. Hope he's doing alright." And that was that. I kept watching different stories. Later that night, something about this story kind of stuck in my gut. It had popped into my mind a few times subconsciously, and I'd ignored it, but it kept coming back, so I decided to go and watch it again. That's when I realized my friend's video wasn't from our college town. It was from my much smaller hometown, which is nowhere near my college. That freaked me out a little. But I figured everyone moved around when the pandemic hit. My town isn't that small. It isn't that far from the college. It was probably a coincidence. I really wanted to mention it to my parents, but they had always warned me against talking to homeless people. Besides, like, can I buy you a meal? So I felt too embarrassed to explain the situation to them. Especially since it was probably a coincidence, and I would sound so conceited if I were like, he definitely followed me because aren't I just so great that he's probably obsessed with me? We have a type 1 diabetic in the family, so we took quarantining very seriously. I figured, I'll never see him anyways. I'm not going out anytime soon. It doesn't matter where he is. And nothing happened. Well, one thing. A girl from my high school who also ended up at my college called me and, in summary, said, "This is going to sound really weird, but I feel like I should say something. I was downtown and a beggar asked me about you. Like, specifically, you. He knew you were on club volleyball. He knew your major. I didn't tell him anything, but I thought you should know." I was pretty alarmed at first, because how would he know I know this girl? But once we talked, I learned she'd been wearing a sweatshirt from our college. So I thought about it and decided he probably saw that sweatshirt. Figured she might know me from college since we were both from this town, and was just trying to find out how I was doing. I thought it was sweet. Also a little weird. But he was a little weird, that was part of his charm. I thanked her, but told her not to worry about it. Besides, I wasn't in town much longer anyways. I had decided to go live back near campus. It was impossible to get my coursework done, with my whole family around all day. So I went back to campus a while later. Didn't think about Wendell at all. Until I saw him back on the same corner just a week after I returned to campus. Okay, even I knew at that time that something was wrong. I stopped giving him money, stopped talking to him, but I was so humiliated by how high and mighty I had been, insisting that nothing was wrong and everyone else was being paranoid and elitist, that I decided not to tell anyone what I had noticed. I was already barely leaving my apartment, never going on campus, and his usual spot was right by campus. I felt bad about potentially hurting his feelings or reading too far into the situation, but I figured he'd get the message, and better safe than sorry. After finals, I decided to visit my brother, in a different state. His roommate had moved home, leaving an extra bed, so I drove up to his place to celebrate the end of the year, and get away from it all. About the 9th day in, I was woken up way earlier than usual. When my brother isn't working, or in school he sleeps until noon, to the sound of my brother talking at the door. I got up to see what was going on, because we weren't seeing anyone. We stayed totally quarantined. His state was being hit hard. My brother was talking nicely to someone outside, through a crack in the door, but when he turned, he looked royally pissed at me. He turned back outside and said, "Hold on here." Closed the door despite the other guy protesting, but I couldn't hear what he said exactly. My brother immediately got in my face and, whisper yelling, said, "Mom and Dad are gonna kill you." I had no idea what he was talking about, but my first thought was the cops had come to arrest me for something. It was the only logical thought I could generate first thing in the morning. The only thing I could imagine being arrested for was my fake ID, which I only even used to get into concerts, and obviously none lately. So I was really in shock. But my brother was still going, as best I can remember because I was panicked at this point. He was saying, "And I'm gonna kill you. This is so not cool. You didn't even ask? I wouldn't have said yes anyways. But you didn't even think to ask." I realized that didn't align with being arrested, so finally I was like, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "You're dating a 40-year-old guy. Older? 45 maybe. Of all the people out there. I mean, Jesus. Dad's gonna kill you and then have a heart attack and die. Which will kill Mom. And you invited him to my house while we're supposed to be social distanced? You two can go to a hotel because he isn't coming in here. I wasn't a dick to him, out of respect for you. But if he doesn't leave now, that's gonna change." So I had no idea what he was talking about. None. I hadn't connected any of the pieces yet. Because you've got to remember, Wendell was such a small part of my life until this point. I almost never saw him or thought about him. My whole world had been turned upside down by a pandemic in the preceding few months. He was background noise. Faint background noise. Compared to all the other stuff I had going on. So I just said the first thing that came to mind. "Dude, I don't know why you're getting so mad at me. I don't have a boyfriend. I don't know what you're talking about. Someone's got the wrong house." My brother looked like he was ready to rip my face off. He said, "We're adults. Come on, don't fucking lie to me. I'm not Mom and Dad. We can't deal with this if you're going to lie to my face." And I said I wasn't lying. And I think he could tell from my expression and tone that I genuinely was serious. So now he was as confused and irritated as I was, and he was like, he didn't just vaguely say he was here for his girlfriend. He used your name. He rattled off a ton of very exact info. I think he said yeah. He said you guys had a fight and he was here to work things out. Now, I've been looking for a boyfriend for a long time, so I was half thinking, maybe dreams do come true. Might as well see who it is. But I was also starting to feel a bit sick in the pit of my stomach because it would be one thing if this happened on campus or back home. But I had changed states. My brother moved to this state for school, and I don't know anyone here but him and his friends. So I finally did the obvious thing and looked through the peephole. I almost didn't recognize him at first because he had showered, shaved, and changed into clean clothes for the first time since I'd known him. But sure as shit, it was Wendell standing on my brother's doorstep, hundreds of miles from his original corner. I was so scared I couldn't speak. My heart was pounding like I was slipping under deep water with my legs tied. I just backed away from the door and sat down on the couch and tried to collect myself. My brother thought this was my affirming that there really was some secret older boyfriend who had just made himself known. So it took a minute for him to cut off his ranting and his dramatic, "What will Grandma think?" stuff. Finally, he realized I was tearing up and he sat down, calmed down, and apologized and said we'd figure it out, and I whispered, still out of breath, "No, you don't understand. He followed me here." My brother still didn't get it. "What? You didn't want him to come here? What was your fight about?" he asked, still thinking the guy was my boyfriend. I managed to repress my panic enough to explain the broad strokes to him. But I don't think he fully grasped how creepy it was in the moment, because he was like, "You're shitting me. That's hilarious. I'll take care of this." He went to the door and called from behind it. "Yo, just checked. She's not here. Must have packed out this morning. You should do the same. I'm taking this social distancing real serious." And winked at me. That's when, as my brother says when he tells this story, it got real. Wendell said, "You're lying. I heard her in there. Tell her I'm sorry. I don't know why she's been avoiding me, but I got cleaned up for her, and I'll take her anywhere she wants to go. Tell her that. Tell her. And don't lie. I'll know if you lie." That rubbed my brother the wrong way, and he said back, "Bro, you're not taking her anywhere, now get off my deck before we have a problem." And Wendell sounded like he was walking away, but instead, he was going over to the window. When I saw him staring, he looked different than I'd ever seen him. Even then, a few seconds earlier when I'd glanced through the peephole, his clothes were clean, but they didn't fit or match. Eyes bugged out of his head, white stuff caked on the corners of his mouth I hadn't noticed at first, shaking, just kind of disconnected from reality. He started banging on the window, shouting things like, "That's my girlfriend. You can't keep her in there. You little bitch ass. Let her out, you bitch ass. Let her out. Let her out. I'm coming, baby. I'm coming." I couldn't tell if it was meant as a threat or a reassurance. I was so scared. I was too scared to run, or even move. I think my brother was almost as surprised by the sudden outburst. He was rolling up his sleeves like he was preparing to go out there, and I was trying to make my voice work to beg him not to. But I was so anxious, scared, embarrassed, and sad that I had missed all the signs leading up to this, all the opportunities to prevent it, that our friendship was never the wholesome thing I thought it was, though of course that's something I had already begun to grapple with before this day, and had so many thoughts swirling in my head, fear being chief among them. All I could do was scream, and cover my ears to drown the whole situation out, before my brother could charge out the door. He's an athletic guy, but I don't think he's ever actually been in a physical fight. Wendell punched through the window. Nothing actually happened when he punched through, and there was an eerie moment of silence where nobody moved. I think even I stopped screaming. But when he pulled his hand back, all hell broke loose. A fair amount of blood started spurting out when he pulled his hand back through the glass. The things he was shouting started to make even less sense, along the lines of, "Look what you did to me. This is a test. I told you I couldn't be stopped, bitch ass." And the look in his eyes got even more distant. I think the sight of the blood, which has always made my brother really squeamish, made him realize this was real, and he finally yelled, "Damn it, sis, call 911. While he leaned against the door which Wendell was now repeatedly running into, even though he was nowhere close to breaking it down. I don't even remember making the call, but apparently I did, because within 10 minutes the police arrested Wendell without resistance. He kept trying to tell them his girlfriend was trapped in the house and he'd come all this way to save her. My poor brother was even momentarily handcuffed and had to explain he hadn't taken me hostage. Probably one of the most haunting memories of the whole event is, as they carted Wendell away for arrest, he started singing opera music. I've learned a lot of important common sense and life lessons from this saga, but most of all, Wendell, let's not meet. Okay, so my friend and I are 24, and we both have young 7-month-old boys. We started off swimming in the big pool, paddling around the middle shallows, with our baby boys in their floaties. They were loving the newfound ability to splash around while floating, while enjoying the water and sun. All of a sudden, this bald guy that looks like he's in his 60s slinks on over from the deep end of the pool, and just starts hanging around us. He had been hanging around a bunch of young kids that were playing, jumping in the deep end, prior to seeing us. But as far as I could see, he didn't seem to have any relations to any of them. Anyway, it started with him slowly coming closer, moving a few meters at a time while stopping to lean against the edge of the pool every 30 seconds or so. Then he crossed the gap between the two walls that separated the shallow kiddie area, ramp entry, and the big pool, and came and stood right next to my friend and me as we were letting our boys play. By this point, my creeper radar is going off like crazy, and I whispered to my friend, "Oh my god, what the hell? This guy is so creepy." She responded saying that she felt the same. He started trying to interact with our sons while they were splashing, and we tried to move away from him, while not encouraging his actions by responding. He just looked as though he wasn't going to leave us alone if we started talking back to him. We moved well away from him to the other shallow end to try and shake him off, but he fucking followed us all the way to the steps, hovering around the wall, trying to stay close to us. Not swimming, just standing, bobbing around in the shallows, looking around the pool and trying to interact with our boys and with us if we happened to get within 2 meters of him while playing with our sons. We then decided to leave the big pool and go to the toddler's pool, because it's a separate fenced-off area. This guy was just being way too creepy for our liking. We were uncomfortable, and he was not getting the hint that we didn't want anything to do with him. As we were leaving, he again tried to interact with our sons, as we had to walk past him to exit the pool. We once again ignored him and walked out to move all our things to the fenced area. He then proceeded to watch us in the baby paddle pool from the big pool, watching and turning away when we would look at him, and when he decided he was done with swimming, he came and sat right up against the fence, next to the toddler pool. He started looking over at us every 5 minutes and turning away whenever we looked at him. I started taking photos at this point, just in case. My mom's senses were screaming stranger danger, and I just wanted to have something that I could use if needed in the future. Anyway, he sat down next to some other guy, right next to the fence of the toddler pool. They sat there talking about God knows what, but he kept on looking over at us. I only knew because I was facing straight at him, but every time my friend turned around, he would snap his head as if he wasn't looking at us. He and his buddy finally left after a while. They left together, and the bald guy was looking at us the entire time. Another woman that was at the pool with us said he had been watching her 10-year-old daughter as she played with the younger kids in the big pool, and that he was giving her the same creeper vibes. Old creepy bald dude at the pool. I don't know if you had bad intentions or were just too ignorant to realize you were being a creeper, but let's not meet ever again and stay the fuck away from our kids. A couple of months ago, while house sitting, dog sitting for my parents, I had an eerie feeling. As an obsessive ID channel watcher and younger female, I played it off as paranoia. During these few days, whenever I took the dog out, he suddenly began sniffing areas he never sniffed before, particularly under each of our windows. And thankfully, it's because of him that I discovered 2 larger footprints under a window that looks directly into our living dining room. Around this same time, about 2 months ago, I noticed a man walking up and down our street that I'd never seen in the entirety of my life. Small Midwestern town. He also had, in my opinion, odd mannerisms, prolonged eye contact, continued staring and craning his neck as he walked by, and never returned my smiles, hellos, or waves. Eventually I became irritated due to how creeped out I was with both him and the eerie feeling in general and decided to wave. Upon no acknowledgement in return, other than a cold stare, I got up and acted like I was going to follow him down the street, which made him walk faster and turn a sudden corner. Never saw him again. Now today, I help my parents out by picking up their dog from the groomers, as it's right up the street and in a safe suburban area. Oftentimes, I don't lock up while running errands in town. When I returned home with the dog, I had an unexplained, horrible feeling the minute I walked in the door. Something, maybe a blanket, seemed misplaced. Something was off. I threw a load of laundry on in the basement and quickly stood up and looked around. No one there. Then I proceed to the bathroom to check my makeup, and right then I look down to my left and there's feces in the toilet, with no toilet paper and not flushed. I've been the only one home all morning. I immediately throw back the shower curtain and start shaking. Adrenaline. And when nothing is there, I close the bathroom door and lock myself inside. I call dispatch. They arrived in less than 2 minutes, searched the entire property, made me check my laptop to see if any recent search history isn't my own. Interesting. And checked the fridge to see if food is missing. All valuables are accounted for. I know this isn't my feces. No one in my family would have a bowel movement and not use toilet paper or flush. I know someone has been here, yet, because I love horror movies and the ID channel, they think I'm crazy. This happened about 15 years ago. I was 21 years old and living in my very first apartment. It was a small bachelor apartment in a sketchy area. I grew up in a town that was known to be rough and tough. I knew how to handle myself and learned at a young age to keep my head down and not to go looking for trouble. My apartment building was behind a bar. A lot of the customers of the bar would stand outside to smoke. When they stood outside to smoke, they would be looking at my apartment. Most of the people who were out smoking kept to themselves. A few would nod and say hello if I passed by. Never any issues until one evening. One evening I came home from work. I passed the bar and saw this extremely tall man outside smoking. As I passed, he stared at me. I gave him a slight nod, but he didn't acknowledge me. He just continued to stare. It made me uncomfortable, but I didn't think much of it. About an hour later, I hear a knock on my door. It was odd because you have to buzz people into the building. The building only had 8 units, and I didn't really know any of the neighbors. I froze because I really didn't want to talk to anyone, but the knocking continued. I finally shouted out, "Who is it?" But there was no response. I shouted again, "Who's there?" And the voice said, "It's Tom." I didn't know anyone named Tom, so I shouted back, "I don't know anyone named Tom. You must have the wrong apartment." The voice said, "You may not know me, but I know you. Open up so we can talk." I went over to the peephole, and it was the tall dude from the bar. I loudly said, "Fuck off, or I'm calling the cops." I heard his footsteps walk away, and heard the building door open and then close. He was gone, or so I thought. A few minutes later, I peeked out the window and he was standing in the parking lot. He seemed to be talking to himself. At this point, I'm freaking out. I called my landlord, who lived in the building next to me. He told me to call the police and that in the meantime, he and his brother would come check things out. I call the police and tell them what's going on. They said a car is on the way. Meanwhile, my landlord and his brother make their way to the parking lot. I watch out my window and see them approach Tall Dude. Tall Dude takes one look at them and bolts. My landlord and his brother try to chase him, but the Tall Dude got away. About 5 minutes later, the police arrive. I give my version of events and also a description of the man. The officer stares at me and says, "We've had reports of a man matching that description who has been sexually assaulting women. Thank God you didn't open the door." A few days later, I get a call from the officer. He told me part of their investigation was talking to the owner of the bar. The owner called the police when the Tall Dude reappeared after a few days, and the police responded and arrested him. About 12 years ago, when I was 22, I worked at a video store. It was a few days before Halloween, and my manager asked me if I would work it since everyone else wanted off. So, me being the good employee I am, I said yes, and asked if I could dress up. She agreed and said I could dress up as whatever I wanted. Can I dress up as a chick? I was just joking actually, until she told me I didn't have the hair on my nuts too. Challenge accepted. I went out shopping and bought a wig, a dress, and some makeup, and I borrowed a bra from my current crazy girlfriend at the time. A story for another time. I did my makeup the way I saw my girlfriend do and proceeded to walk to work. Now I only lived about a half mile from the store, and since I lived within walking distance to everything, I didn't see the need for a car at the time. So I started walking. I had to cross the street, walk across a bridge, cut through an abandoned parking lot, and go through an alley, and I was there. It was dark outside, but I've never had anybody bother me while I was out for a nightly walk until this night. About halfway across the bridge, I look up and see a man in his late 20s, maybe early 30s, walking towards me. As I get a little closer, I realize the fucker is checking me out. I giggle a little bit and laugh at the thought that I must make a pretty hot chick. I walk past him and continue on my way. As I walk and continue to let my mind wander in La La Land, I get through the parking lot and start down the alley when I hear someone say, "Hey sexy girl," and I feel my ass get slapped. Not like a love tap, but a full-blown painful ass slap. The kind that leaves red marks. "What the fuck?" I yell as I turn around and confront this asshole and realize it was the punk I passed on the bridge. Oh shit. Man. Sorry. He was obviously caught off guard. Looking back on it now, I can't stop laughing as I type this, but at the time, I was beyond livid. I grabbed him by the cuff of his shirt and shoved him on the ground. I moved in to kick him a few times, but he was pretty quick to get on his feet and run away. He took off the way we came, repeatedly yelling, "Shit, shit, 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 shit." I stood there just stunned for another minute, thinking to myself, what in the hell just happened? I went into work, and as soon as my manager saw me, she started laughing. "I didn't think you were actually going to do it." Of course, she laughed even harder when I told her how I was almost sexually assaulted. So, I'm on a trip backpacking around Europe with my brother, currently in Paris. We're staying at this hostel, and we're in a 10-bunk bedroom. There was this one guy in the room who was immediately super weird. Almost right away, like as soon as we got settled, he starts talking to us about flying to Libya. He's all, "Us, Libya, fly tomorrow," and me and my brother are just like, "Nah, dude." He keeps saying it, we keep saying no, and he's getting progressively more assertive about it. As me and my brother are going around doing sightseeing and stuff, I keep seeing this dude around. When we're at the hostel, he kept following us to the dining hall, out onto the terrace, and I'm getting more creeped out. My brother, ever the non-assertive soul he is, just laughs it off like the dude is joking. This goes on for 2 days. Well, this morning we were going out to breakfast, and I forgot my phone back in the room, so I told my brother to just go ahead and I ran back to get it. I go in the room, and the dude is sitting there. There's no one else in the room, and I honestly contemplated just leaving it. But I didn't trust it alone in the room, so I planned to just grab it quickly. That morning he was still on about Libya and was essentially driving us nuts about it, despite me repeatedly telling him to stop talking to us. I go in and grab my phone when he suddenly just yells, "Libya. Now, we go now." I'm very scared since at this point we are the only ones in the room, and I just say fuck off, dude. And I go to leave when he blocks the door and grabs my shoulder, still going on about going to the airport and flying to Libya. I shove past him and run away to where my brother and I were going to breakfast. I decided that we were going to switch rooms because this dude was officially creep level 100. We make it back to the hostel, and before we talk to the front desk, we went outside for a smoke and he shows up. I almost yell at him to leave us alone and he flat out says no. I go to the front desk and explain that this dude has been harassing us and we wanted to change rooms. I mentioned what went down in the room, and before I knew it, the cops were called and I was giving a statement. As they were sorting it out, there were a couple things that jumped out at me. This guy didn't pay in advance. Normally, when you're staying in a hostel, you pay the full amount up front, or if you're staying for a while, you pay weekly. He was paying by the day. He had several pieces of ID in his wallet, none of which matched his description. Apparently, Paris has been having a problem with human trafficking. This guy was escorted out of the hostel by police. He was banned from staying there again, ever. Me and my brother switched rooms, and we were given vouchers for free dinners for the rest of our stay here. And now, I'm terrified to go out by myself. I swear, if me and that guy had been alone in a more secluded place that didn't have cameras everywhere, I could have been shipped off to Libya. After high school many years ago, I was in a bad place. My guardian had kicked me out after graduation. She didn't help me find a place to stay, so I lived in my car for a couple of months. I met some heavy metal dudes at work one day. I'd seen them around town, and all my other friends knew who they were. Everyone loved them. We became friends over a couple months, and they offered for me to move in with them. I agreed. Looking back now, I wish I had just stayed in my car. My two main roommates were brothers, named Andrew and Seth. They were in a band. They also believed in the occult and anything of that sort. I never really believed in that stuff, but I'm not one to tell someone what they should believe. They had let me live with them rent-free for several months, so who was I to complain? Being the only female in a house full of young men, I was always looking over my shoulder. You never know who you can trust. Turns out I was right to worry. Over time, their friends started to stay with us for longer periods of time, sometimes weeks. Their friends were another group of brothers that they had gone to school with. There were 5 brothers in total, but only 2 stayed with us consistently. The younger brother, Mark, was very polite. He cleaned up after himself and always helped with the household chores. The other brother, Adam, had a laundry list of mental problems. He had apparently done some bad drugs back in the day, and it had developed into what seemed like psychosis of the religious sort. He had done time in prison for assaulting a woman with a Bible. He would often look you in the eyes and tell you he could see how you would die. Once he told me that I was possessed by a demon, and I needed my soul cleansed. Everyone in the house knew he had these problems, but he was their friend. They helped him through the hard times and gave him a place to stay. Otherwise, he would be on the streets. I was always on guard around him after the things he told me. No one else seemed to be as concerned as I was. They should have been. One day I was sleeping and my phone rang. It was my boss. He asked if I could come into work an hour early. It was only 12 p.m. I was broke and had nothing better to do, so I said yes. I got up and began getting ready to leave. I walked out into the living room to see Mark and Andrew sitting on the couch, while Adam sat on the floor by the TV. He was watching scripture videos on YouTube. Some real end-of-days shit. That was fairly common, so I went about my business. I said goodbye and left for work. My shift at work was almost complete when the phone rang. My boss answered, handed the phone to me and said, "For you." I was just a cashier, so I assumed it was a friend that couldn't reach me on my phone. I answered the phone and heard a man's voice that I didn't recognize. "Hi, this is Detective Williams. Something happened at your apartment today, and we need you to come to the station to talk about it." I left work immediately. I had assumed one of the brothers had been arrested for drug dealing or something. I was very wrong. I got to the station and was buzzed in. An officer escorted me to a small cold room with a camera, gave me a bottle of water, and left me by myself for about 30 minutes. My mind was racing, thinking about what could have happened. He came back in and informed me that Adam had stabbed and killed Andrew at around 1 p.m. I was shocked. I had just left the house an hour before it happened, and everything seemed fine. I asked if there had been a fight. The detective informed me that there hadn't been a fight, and it seemed to have happened out of nowhere. I gave my statement to the police and left with nowhere to go, still in shock and confused out of my mind. Our apartment was a crime scene, so I went to another friend's house to watch the news report, since the police wouldn't give me any information on the case. Over the next couple of days, the information began to be released. Adam hadn't just stabbed Andrew once, not twice, but he had stabbed him over and over and nearly decapitated him. After the murder, he ran down the road still holding the murder weapon. He called 911 and informed them what he had done. I watched the news report in horror. We had known he was unstable, but this? He had fully confessed to the brutal murder and provided police with his notebooks. He had apparently been planning to murder all of his brothers, my roommates, and me. He thought we were possessed by demons, and this was the only way to free us. Luckily, none of his other intended victims were there that day. Mark unfortunately witnessed the murder, but he luckily escaped. If I hadn't gotten that call from my boss, I wouldn't be alive today. So, to the man who brutally murdered my friend and wanted to murder me, let's never meet again.